Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I did a badass demon skull belt for an upcoming shoot that I have. I found a cool image of a Danzig style skull that kind of looked like a demon with horns that I added to a white background. I did have to enlarge it because I wanted to make it very big and true to size on how I was going to craft it. So I decided I will be making this out of air dry clay. So I wanted to make sure that I can get in all the details as much as possible. I made sure that I printed out the image so I could have it in front of me because I was going to be recording this. It's kind of hard to look at my phone and record at the same time. So I did go ahead and print this out for accessibility for this project. So you guys have no idea how excited I was for this project. I actually have not used air dried clay since like 2015, which was actually like the last time that I had cosplayed. And I actually am super excited for this shoot. So this character that I'm pretty much embodying is not something from a TV show or a game or something. It's something that I just kind of like pieced together and kind of created in my own mind. So it kind of makes things more exciting. I definitely did not know what I was getting myself into. Originally, it took like a little over an hour to make the actual skull itself. So I started off just trying to handcraft the parts of the skull itself, just like the base, and that did not go well. So I completely took it apart and just started making the base on the actual paper itself and just kind of hoping for the best. And just as a PSA, no Play-Doh snakes were harmed in the making of this craft. And I know it kind of looks weird from the outside just seeing how the clay sits on the paper, but like trust the process, please. Just like trust my process because at the end it looked pretty sick. I started feeling a little bit more confident about the project, so I decided to take it off the paper and put it on a plate just because I wanted to get more into depth on the features of the skull itself, and I'm very limited on what I can do on the paper, and especially because I still need to see the features. So if you pay close attention, I am using some tools I got from my kids, like actual Play-Doh kits, and I was just using it to create texture and depth within the actual prop. I did notice that it was easier for me to make the teeth by hand and then add them in to the project versus just adding the clay onto the skull and then sculpting it while it's attached, because it can alter the way that the base looks. So I was also working on limited time because I had recently cleared up a lot of space in my phone, and I really had no idea how long I was able to record because I did record the video in 4K, and that definitely took up a lot of space, especially with the video originally being 1 hour long. So I tried to add the top of the skull, which I originally did by hand, and then later on decided that that was not what was going to happen because it was kind of hard to look at the actual photo and just kind of like copy the image itself. It looks alright to me kind of, but like when I put it on top of the skull, it just didn't look right. I still felt like the bones kind of looked a little 2D, so I decided to give them a bit more dimension, and this was definitely the cause of making the base all together. If I would have just rolled them out by hand, I could have made them more rounded, but thankfully I took my time with that and then, you know, added around it to create that 3D texture and actual bone look I was going for. I don't want it to look kind of cheesy and costumey. I wanted to make it look like it was an actual skull I was wearing and make it look pretty hardcore. I did want to go for a feel like I was actually wearing, you know, a skull on my body. Like it was actually something that, you know, I fought and killed and I'm displaying it sort of like a trophy. So I really wanted to go in depth and make sure that I made it look like an actual skull, not just something flat and off paper. Like, wanted to actually sculpt it because we are using clay after all, and that's what sculpting is for. It's creating, you know, those different elements to make the project look believable. So I decided to stop procrastinating and work on some of the more key elements like the face. I did start sculpting around the eyes to make it look a little bit more angry and a little bit more brutal. So I wanted to give him a really mean kind of look. Aside of doing the eyebrows, I did start to work around the top of the head where the top horn was going to be. I did want to make sure that I had room for all of the spikes shown, which thankfully I was able to make happen. It looks like I did miss a few details, so I did want to go ahead and add the horns. And again, I wanted to use the same technique where I rolled them by hand and then added the encasing to give it that texture and that 3D look. So these horns ended up becoming a pain in my rear. So for some reason, I didn't add them like level. It looked like one was higher to me, and yeah, I had to make sure that I moved them around to make sure that they were level with each other, and then go back and add some details because there were a few minor things that I feel like I could have added to make it look a little bit more like a realistic skull. And then I started adding some of the horns. I wanted to make sure I did have that space after all, and make sure that they were similar to the photo in terms of like the size ratio to each other and the shape. So even though on paper the skull would have been roughly the same size, I did have to add extra space on the top just to make sure that all of the horns fit. So I wanted to make the horns a little bit easier to see because this will be on camera, and I did want to make them rather large. So I did make them bigger than they seem like they would be on the paper itself. There is no doubt whatsoever that I'm a perfectionist, so I did want to go ahead and create more depth in the eyes. And then as I was working on some of the other details, I did notice that the smaller details weren't up to my standards pretty much, so I kept messing with the horns. Just I felt like that one on the left was still kind of flat looking, and I wanted it more rounded and of course, like I said, more realistic. So I did keep going back and then editing around it just to fix my little OCD needs. I did need to work on the top of the skull. Like I said before, I didn't know how much space I had on my phone available, and I do need to go ahead and let this dry and create a paint coat on it. And I definitely needed to stop hyperfixating on some of the smaller details, even though that they were driving me literally insane. I did want to ensure that the horns were secure, especially with smaller details in clay. Depending on what you're making, you have to make sure that they're pretty snug in place, or that they're pretty thick, or else they can get easily snapped. On the photo itself, it did look like there was kind of grooves or like a higher kind of protrusion. So I did want to go ahead and incorporate that detail. From there, I wanted to go ahead and start on the best part, which were the horns. So it was going to be hard for me to make them wrap around, and of course I wanted to do this in a timely manner. So I did just make them in this similar shape, just not kind of like curving as much. I started running out of space, so I had to go ahead and use a giant spatula to kind of like work around the edges, kind of like a little pancake, and move it over and center it so I had more space to work on the horns. I wanted these horns to be as dramatic as possible, so I did add a lot of clay to make them very thick on the base, and then started adding those little details in the photo, like the little grooves, to give them texture. Of course, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. This is going to be it for this video. I do have to make a part 2, since I have to show how I'm gonna actually turn this into a belt. I'm gonna have to paint this as well, so that's gonna take a lot of time. I do have to add a base and all that, so I'm gonna show you that in the next video. Bye for now.